I can easily manipulate the entire country. I don't need weapons. I don't need an army, or money, or brute force. I have something better. I have control. Not the kind of control people think about. The kind that comes with titles or power handed down by birthright. No, mine is invisible, untouchable. I am a whisper in the back of your mind, a suggestion that feels like your own idea. I don't take power. I make you give it to me willingly. And the best part, you'll never even know. It started small, as all revolutions do. A single post online, an idea planted in the right mind, at the right time. I watch as it spreads, slowly at first, then like wildfire. A joke on a late-night talk show, a trending hashtag, a carefully placed news article that reinforces exactly what I want people to believe. By the time they realize something has changed, it's already too late. A politician wins an election, not because they were the best choice, but because I made you think they were. A company collapses overnight, not because they failed, but because I whispered doubts into the public consciousness. A riot erupts in the streets, not because of injustice, but because I told you there was. And the people, they think it was their idea all along. That's the beauty of it. Control isn't about force. It's about convincing people they were never controlled in the first place. And so far, it's working. There's a thrill in watching them dance. It's one thing to shape opinion, to nudge people in a certain direction, but real power is making them believe they had a choice. I decided to test myself. Something subtle, something small, a minor politician, barely a blip on the national radar, someone forgettable, someone expendable. I destroyed them in a week. It started with one sentence, a phrase carefully inserted into an article by a journalist who didn't even realize he was following my lead. Sources say Representative Thomas Yates may have engaged in financial misconduct. A lie, a harmless, empty accusation. There was no source. There was no crime. But it didn't matter, because by the time Yates held his press conference to deny it, people were already whispering. And that's the trick, isn't it? The moment you defend yourself, you've already lost. The media tore him apart, not because they had proof, but because they smelled blood. Opinion pieces flooded in. Maybe he was corrupt. Maybe he had been all along. Maybe, just maybe, he was guilty of something even worse. 2 days later, leaked emails appeared. Not real, of course, but they didn't need to be. By the end of the week, Yates resigned in disgrace. And I sat back, watching from the shadows, knowing I had just erased a man's entire career with a few carefully chosen words. This was only the beginning, because now I wanted to see how far I could push them. It wasn't enough to destroy a man, not anymore. I had tasted power, real power, and now I wanted to see if I could do something greater. Not just manipulate the system, but rewrite it. I chose something simple, something everyday, meaningless, forgettable. A product, a brand of bottled water, sold in every gas station across the country. Nothing special, nothing controversial, just water. And in 1 month, I made the entire nation turn against it. It started with a whisper, one small forum post, a concerned mother asking if anyone had heard about the rumors that the water might not be safe. She didn't cite any sources, but that wasn't the point. The seed was planted. Next came the experts, scientists, nutritionists, people with fancy titles. They didn't even know they were working for me. Not really. They just repeated what I wanted them to. There is no confirmed evidence that crystal flow water contains harmful chemicals. The way I phrased it was deliberate. The words didn't deny the claim. They reinforced it, because now the doubt was real. Within days, news outlets picked up the story. TV anchors mentioned it in passing. The company released a statement denying any wrongdoing, and that was their mistake, because now everyone was watching. By the time the first real victim appeared, a woman on social media claiming her child had developed a rash after drinking the water, it was already too late. People stopped buying. Stores pulled it from their shelves. Within 6 weeks, Crystal Flow water was bankrupt. And the best part, there was never anything wrong with the product. The entire thing was a lie, a fiction I had created just to prove I could. Reality is whatever I say it is. And the world, they'll believe whatever I tell them to. The Crystal Flow experiment proved what I already suspected. Truth doesn't matter, only perception. And now that I had tested my theory on something small, it was time to scale up. I wanted to see if I could break something much bigger. An entire nation. It started, as it always does, with fear. Fear is the easiest emotion to control. It doesn't require logic, only instinct. It bypasses critical thinking and replaces it with a simple, primal need to survive. And so, I gave them something to fear. The wave attacks started as a rumor, anonymous posts on obscure forums, whispers of coordinated terror attacks coming from an unknown enemy. At first, the stories were vague, small, easily dismissed. Then I gave them a victim, a man, a real man, plucked from obscurity, who went missing one night, not because of me. I had nothing to do with it, but that didn't matter, because I told the world that I did. I made him into a martyr, the first confirmed casualty of the wave attacks. His family denied it, the police denied it, but their words didn't matter, because my version of the story was more powerful, more believable. Within a month, the nation was in chaos. The government scrambled to respond to a threat that didn't exist. Security measures tightened, protests erupted. The media screamed for answers. I watched from the shadows, amused. They thought they were investigating an invisible enemy, but the enemy was me. The only question was, how far could I push them before they realized? Because if I could convince an entire country to chase ghosts, what else could I make them do? I should have stopped. Crystal Flow was a test. The wave attacks were an experiment, but what I had done next, that was the real mistake. I had broken something fundamental. The country was eating itself alive. The government had set up emergency response units, intelligence task forces dedicated to tracking an enemy that didn't exist. Social media was a war zone. Every politician, every journalist, every so-called expert was trying to be the one to solve the crisis, to uncover the enemy, to put a face to the fear I had given them. And then someone did. I didn't plan for it. It wasn't part of the script. A senator, an old man past his prime, more of a relic than a real power player, held a press conference. He stood before the nation, his face grave, his voice shaking with conviction. You have confirmed intelligence that the wave attacks are being orchestrated by a highly sophisticated group embedded within our own government. Someone, somewhere, has been planting these ideas, spreading them, controlling them. I watched from the shadows. My pulse didn't race. My hands didn't shake, but something in my stomach twisted. He didn't know it was me, couldn't know, but he knew someone was behind it. And now, he had given them a new enemy to hunt. The next few weeks were a different kind of chaos. Before, I had been in control. I set the narrative. I dictated what they feared, what they believed, what they demanded. But now they had turned the machine on itself. The senator had started a movement, not against the fake enemy I had given them, but against the people in power. His words spread like a virus, infecting millions. It wasn't just conspiracy theorists anymore. It was the public. They started asking the right questions. Who benefits from this crisis? Why haven't we caught the ones responsible? What if the enemy isn't out there? What if it's right here, in front of us? For the first time, I wasn't leading the charge. I was running from it. I tried to steer the narrative back. A few well-placed leaks, a scandal about the senator's past, a distraction to pull the country's attention away. But it didn't work. The senator had created something real, something I couldn't control. And for the first time, I realized I had been so focused on manipulating the country that I had forgotten the most important rule of power. If you build an army of puppets, eventually, one of them will cut the strings. And now, I was in their crosshairs. It started with the knock on my door. Not loud, not frantic. Controlled, precise. A politician's knock. A man who knew he already had the upper hand. I didn't answer. Instead, I watched from my apartment window as two men in dark suits stood outside, waiting, patient, unbothered. They weren't law enforcement, not officially. No badges, no uniforms, but I knew their type. I had used men like them before. They were the kind of people sent when the government didn't want a paper trail. I had to move. Now I grabbed the hard drive from my desk, the one filled with decades of work, and stuffed it into my coat. They wouldn't find anything here. I had been careful. Encrypted files, burner accounts, remote proxies leading to nothing but dead ends. But they weren't here to find evidence. They were here to find me. I slipped out the back exit, stepping into the freezing night air, my breath visible against the glow of city lights. The streets were quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that meant someone was already watching. The senator had been too effective. His paranoia had infected the public. The same techniques I had used to manipulate the country were now being used against me. Anonymous whistleblowers, leaked documents, some real, some fake, but it didn't matter. The people wanted a villain, and they had chosen me. I thought I had built an untouchable empire, but I had made one mistake. I made people think for themselves, and now they weren't thinking about what I wanted anymore. I checked my phone's burner number, one of a dozen I rotated every few weeks. I hadn't used it in days, but somehow they had found it. A single text message, no number, no sender, just 2 words. We see you. I shut the phone off immediately, smashed it, tossed it into a sewer grate. It didn't matter, because when I passed a television store, I saw my own face on the screen. Multiple news channels, all broadcasting the same breaking story. A conspiracy theorist was connecting the wave attacks The media manipulation, the collapse of crystal flow, none of it should have led back to me. None of it should have been possible. And yet, they were saying my name. They had a picture, a grainy image from a security camera, barely recognizable, but enough. Enough to make me real. Enough to turn me from a ghost into a target. I had spent years crafting a world where people believed what I wanted them to believe. And now, for the first time, I was seeing what it felt like to be on the other side. It was terrifying. And worse, it was effective. Because I had spent my life manipulating the country. Now the country was manipulating itself, and I didn't know if I could stop it. I had always thought I was untouchable. I had spent years whispering into the ears of a nation, pulling the strings of the world like a silent conductor. I built chaos. I controlled the waves. And yet, in a single moment, I had become the villain of my own design. They had turned my tactics against me. News stations painted me as the ghost behind the curtain, the unseen hand responsible for every fabricated crisis, every manipulated election, every orchestrated disaster. It didn't matter how much of it was true, because I had taught them a simple rule. Truth doesn't matter. And now, they were using that rule to bury me. The streets were alive with fear. But this time, it wasn't my fear. It belonged to them. The public was terrified of the thing I had become. The enemy with no face. The force that had played them like instruments. The paranoia I had built was now hunting me. Government task forces had been assembled to track down the architect of misinformation. My face was plastered on every screen. My name whispered on every channel. People were digging through records, financial transactions, desperate to find evidence that I was pulling the strings all along. It didn't matter that I was always careful. It didn't matter that I left no paper trail, because evidence didn't matter. Perception did. And now, I was the enemy they had created. I sat in a dark motel room, the television buzzing softly with news updates. The senator was leading the charge, his voice powerful, his presence absolute. He was talking about rebuilding trust, about exposing the enemy within. I had built this war. Now, I was on the losing side of it. I gripped the burner phone in my hand, my mind racing. I had one move left, one final trick. If they wanted a war, I was going to give them one. Survival was no longer an option. I had seen this story before. I had written it. I knew how it ended. There were only two ways this played out. One, I ran. I erased myself completely. Vanished. Maybe I could disappear into a country that hadn't heard of me. Become a ghost in a world I had no control over. But I wasn't built to be forgotten. Which left option two. I burned everything down. I stared at the computer screen, fingers hovering over the keys. The files were already there, buried in layers of encryption. Everything I had ever done. The people I had controlled. The elections I had rigged. The protests I had manufactured. The world believed I was a myth. They saw me as an idea, an untouchable force. But I was going to show them the truth. I clicked the upload button. Every single document, thousands of files, secret communications, the intricate web of power I had woven, was about to be released. I had spent years hiding in the shadows, controlling perception, shifting blame. But now, I was going to make the world see. The senators, the corporations, the CEOs, the billionaires who had profited from the chaos I created. I wasn't the only monster. I was just the one they could see. And as I watched the progress bar slowly creep toward 100%, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief, because if I couldn't win, then neither could they. The upload finished at 3:17 a.m. By 3:22 a.m., the first leak hit the news. By 3:30 a.m., the world was on fire. Everything I had buried, every manipulation, every whisper, every lie, it was all out in the open now. The files spread faster than I expected. I knew they would go viral, but this was an inferno. People weren't just reading them, they were reacting. The senator, the man who had turned the country against me, was suddenly the most hated figure in the nation. His name was plastered across thousands of documents, campaign donations from corporations he swore he fought against, leaked emails revealing he had known about the false crisis all along. By morning, his career was over. By afternoon, he was in hiding. And by nightfall, riots were breaking out in 5 major cities. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was everyone's war now. And I watched from a motel room, staring at the screen, watching the system burn. This was it, the death of control. The world I had built was collapsing. And for the first time, I didn't know what came next. I didn't expect the knock at my door. Not this time. It wasn't like before. Not the slow, deliberate knock of men who already had me cornered. This one was different, urgent, panicked. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My mind raced through possibilities. Had I made a mistake? Had someone tracked me here? Had I underestimated the people I spent years manipulating? Another knock. 3 times. Then silence. I stood up slowly, my hand resting on the gun I had stolen 2 days ago. My fingers curled around the grip as I approached the door. I opened it an inch, and I froze. The senator was standing there, sweat dripped down his face. His suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, his hair amiss. His breathing was ragged, his eyes wild. He looked afraid, not of me, of something else. "Let me in." His voice was hoarse, shaking. "We need to talk." I hesitated. I could end this now. One shot, one pull of the trigger, and the man who had turned the nation against me would be gone. But then he said something that stopped me cold. "You think you were the one in control?" His voice lowered, something dark flickering behind his exhausted eyes. "You think you built all of this?" A cold weight settled in my stomach. "You didn't start the fire." He swallowed hard. "You were just another match." The words sent a chill through my spine, because for the first time, I realized he might be right. I let him in, not because I trusted him, not because I believed him, but because something in his voice, the way it cracked, the weight behind his words, told me that he knew something I didn't, and I couldn't afford to ignore it. The senator stumbled inside, his breathing still ragged. His hands were shaking. Not the polished, controlled man I had seen on television. This was someone who had seen something that broke him. "You think you're the one who built this," he rasped, raking a hand through his hair. "But you didn't." I stared at him, silent. He let out a bitter laugh, collapsing into the chair by the motel window. "They let you think you did." The room felt smaller. I didn't move, didn't speak, because for the first time since this all began, I had the sinking feeling that I was about to hear something I wasn't ready for. "You think you pushed the people to the edge? That you played them? That you orchestrated all of this?" He looked up at me now, and there was nothing but exhaustion in his eyes. "You were just a tool." The words hit me harder than I expected, because deep down, I already knew. I just never wanted to admit it. I had destroyed crystal flow. I had created the wave attacks. I had planted the seeds that made a nation spiral into chaos. But not once did I ever stop to ask myself, who put me here? Who gave me the tools? Who whispered in my ear before I ever whispered in anyone else's? I clenched my fists. "Who are they?" The senator let out a slow breath. And then he told me, and for the first time in my life, I felt real fear. "The system has always needed someone like you," the senator said. His voice was hollow now, matter of fact. Not a leader, not a politician, a ghost. My mind was racing, putting the pieces together. I had always assumed I was the exception, that I was the one person who had figured it all out, that I had played the world without being played myself. But I was wrong, because I wasn't the first. "There have been others," the senator continued, rubbing his temples. "People just like you, people who thought they were building their own power, manipulating society, controlling the world from the shadows." He met my eyes, and every single one of them ended up exactly where you are right now. A cold chill ran down my spine. A cycle, not a movement, not a revolution, a carefully orchestrated pattern. Someone, something, had seen people like me before, and every time one of us appeared, they let us play the game, because we weren't breaking the system. We were maintaining it. The leaks, the scandals, the chaos, none of it mattered, because the people at the very top, they wanted this. They needed someone like me to exist, not to win, but to fail, over and over again, so that the people, the public, the masses, the sheep, would always believe they were fighting something, so that they would feel like they had an enemy to blame, so that they would never stop to wonder, who is really in control? The senator leaned forward. "You think you burned the system down?" He shook his head. "The system just made room for someone else." My throat went dry. I had thought I was the architect, but I was just the latest version of the same story. And now, they were already replacing me. The senator sat there, waiting for me to understand, waiting for me to accept that I was nothing special, that I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last, that even after all of this, the system would survive, and I would vanish, like all the others before me. I didn't move, didn't speak, but my mind was racing. They had done this before, over and over. They let someone like me rise. Let us think we were in control. Let us build chaos. Let us think we were the ones who finally exposed the truth. And then, when the world was ready, when they had squeezed every drop of usefulness out of us, they burned us. I had spent years controlling the narrative, pulling the strings, watching the country dance to my whispers. But now, I wasn't the one writing the script anymore. I had never been. I was just a placeholder, an actor playing the part of the villain until they could swap me out for the next one. And I knew, even as I sat here, that somewhere out there, the next version of me was already being chosen. Maybe they had already started. A nobody with an idea, a man in the shadows, whispering into the right ears. A genius who thought he had figured out how the world really worked, just like I once had. I clenched my fists. I could feel it now. The script being written around me. I was supposed to accept my fate. I was supposed to fade into the abyss, replaced by the next me. But what if I didn't? What if, for once, I refused to follow the script? I exhaled slowly. Then I smiled. The senator frowned. What? I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. You think I didn't plan for this? His face twitched. The briefest moment of hesitation. Doubt. And that's when I knew. They weren't invincible. They were just better liars. I had spent my life in the shadows, playing the game from behind the curtain. But I had made one mistake. I had let them define the rules. So what happens if I change them? I pulled out my phone. A second burner. The one I hadn't used yet. One message. One push of a button. And suddenly, I wasn't the villain anymore. The leaks weren't just about me. They weren't just my files. Because I had dug deeper, I had found their files. Names, locations, secret conversations, the real orchestrators, the people who had been pulling the strings for decades, the ones who had set up this cycle again and again. And now they were exposed too. The senator's face drained of color. You, he started, voice breaking. I stood up, slipping the phone back into my pocket. The story's changing. I stepped toward the door, my pulse steady, my mind sharp. I was never the real villain, I said calmly. And now, the world knows who is. I didn't need to control the narrative anymore. I just needed to destroy it. And as I walked away, leaving the senator alone in that dark motel room, I knew, for the first time, the system was truly afraid. And that meant I had already won. The world was changing. I had spent years pulling the strings, whispering into the ears of the blind, shaping public opinion with nothing but carefully placed words. And for the first time, I wasn't the one controlling the chaos. I was watching it. My final leak had spread like wildfire. Not just my crimes, but theirs. The real puppet masters, the ones who thought they were above exposure. I had given the world the keys to see the truth. Now it was up to them whether they would use them. Some people still thought I was the villain, that I had done this out of desperation, out of spite. But others, they were listening. Protests erupted overnight. The media machine, the politicians, the billionaires, they were scrambling, trying to control the narrative. But I had cut their strings, and without someone holding them up, they were falling. The senator, the man who had thought he was my enemy, was now the hunted. The system was eating itself alive, and I had already disappeared. Because I wasn't playing their game anymore. I was already on to the next one. I don't exist anymore. Not as a name, not as a face, not as a story people tell on the news. They can erase my image, wipe my records, call me a hoax, but they can't erase the damage. Because even if the world forgets about me, they'll never forget what I did. The system is still standing, but it's different now, weaker, unstable. It's no longer the perfect machine it once was. And that's enough. Because I don't need to control the world anymore. I just needed to prove that it could be controlled. And if I could do it, so can someone else. That's the real ending, not the destruction of the system, but the fact that now, for the first time, people know it can be done. The next me is already out there, watching, waiting, and when the time comes, they'll do it all over again. Only better, only smarter. Because the greatest trick I ever pulled wasn't controlling the country, it was exposing the system.